Hello and welcome. We're going to get started now. My name is Gail Sunderman. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This event is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Baltimore City and the League of Women Voters of Baltimore County. Our two leagues are working together on events like this one to engage our members, expand the visibility of the League of Women Voters, and hopefully attract new members. We are grateful to the Naacp Free Library, who is also a sponsor of this event. A quick note on technical issues for tonight. This event is being recorded. Following the speaker, Mara Braverman will moderate questions and answers. So we encourage you to put your questions in the chat function and start to think about them now. Before we go, I want to recognize you in our audience. Many of you are members from the city or the county leagues, but also from leagues across Maryland. We also have a few who are joining us from out of state. And we are particularly pleased to have many others who are not members yet from across the state. So if you're not already a member of the League, we encourage you to join. The League is a nonpartisan, grassroots-oriented group. It is one organization where you can get involved in your community and in issues at the local, state, and national level. I always like to say, unlike so many organizations these days who are always hitting all of us up for money, we don't just ask for your money, we provide an opportunity to get involved and be part of a community, as we are seeing here today. In the chat, we put a link to find a local league. This will take you to the League of Women Voters website, where you can find information on a league in your community. So if you have requested information on the league when you registered, we plan to follow up. So it's a really great organization, and we hope that you will join us today. So let's take down this slide. Thank you. As I said, I'm Gail Sunderman, and we're very pleased to have you here today. This event was inspired in part by the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment that extended suffrage to women. African American women played a vital role in that fight and what came afterwards. We are very fortunate and pleased to have Professor Martha Jones with us tonight to talk about that struggle and her new book, Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. Professor Jones is the author of several books and journal articles and the recipient of prestigious awards recognizing her work. In addition to Vanguard, she is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America. She is also the author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman's Quest in African American Political Culture, 1830 to 1900. So you can see she's a historian. She is also co-editor of Torden in the Intellectual History of Black Women. Professor Jones holds a Ph.D. in history from Columbia University and a J.D. from the CUNY School of Law. Prior to the start of her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City. So I want to welcome Professor Jones. So I'm going to turn this over to her. Professor Jones.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Gail. And thank you to everybody at the League of Women Voters, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, or wherever you might be joining us from. I know so many of us regret not having the opportunity to be together face to face, but I'm delighted that the technology means that we have folks joining us from wherever they might be. So thank you to everybody for being a part of this conversation. I'm going to talk for a while, and then as I understand it, Mara Braverman will join me and we'll have some discussion and an opportunity to answer questions. So please, if you have questions, let us know, because we'll be very happy to address them. So if you mentioned to me that you're celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, you might notice that I cringe a little. Now, don't get me wrong, as you've heard, I've just finished a book, Vanguard, which is about the history of Black women in the vote. And I'm as eager as anyone to talk about the history of this anniversary and its significance to the nation's past. And it's also true, though, that I still can't bring a spirit of celebration to the occasion. It's an impulse that might just get in the way of the story that I have to tell. When we appreciate what an open secret Black women's disenfranchisement was in 1920, the facts of the 19th Amendment fit awkwardly with celebrations. In 1920, members of Congress who promulgated the 19th Amendment, state lawmakers who ratified it, and suffragists themselves all understood that nothing in the amendment's terms prohibited states from strategically using poll taxes, literacy tests, understanding clauses to keep Black women from registering to vote. Nothing in the new amendment promised to curb the intimidation and violence that threatened Black women who came out to polling places. In 1920, voting rights and voter suppression went hand in hand. Now, I'm a historian, and so fortunately for folks who have been planning celebrations, I have very little to do with such things. But my work this year has been important to the degree that we hoped to cut through some half-truths and myths about the past, to use the opportunity of the 19th Amendment centennial to strengthen our critical capacity to think about the past and the future of democracy. So when I'm asked why I stayed home from celebrations, I note that the centennial of the 19th Amendment marks a milestone in the American story of voting rights. I add that remembering that era of voter suppression can help us to see more clearly how ballots are being withheld from Americans in our own time. And our conversations, I hope, even encourage us to recommit to the ongoing work of ensuring voting rights for all Americans. I'm eager to contribute the stories of Black women to our collective understanding. And still, as a nation, we're not quite yet ready for a grand celebration. The promise of voting rights for all still remains out on the horizon. So let's go back to August of 1920 and recall a bit of what happened there. My aim is to, if you will, bust two myths that oftentimes surround the telling of the 19th Amendment. The first is the myth that the 19th Amendment won American women the right to vote. You might even heard it said that the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the right to vote. We'll talk more about that. At the same time, there's a second myth that almost runs contrary to the first. It is that in 1920, no Black women won the right to vote, that racism kept Black women from the polls in 1920, even after a federal amendment. In August of 1920, the US Secretary of State certified that the 19th Amendment to the Constitution had been ratified by the required 36 states. And it went like this, and I think the language is instructive for us. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what precisely did that mean for American women? Well, now, laws that reserved the ballot for men violated the Constitution. They were unenforceable. And still, the 19th Amendment did not promise women the vote. Laws, state laws, still kept women from the polls based upon age, citizenship, residency, mental competence. And in 1920, it was still true that American women who married non-citizens, non-US citizens, were denaturalized, lost their citizenship, and hence their right to vote. So the women who showed up to register in the fall of 1920 still confronted many hurdles, even if sex wasn't one of them. Of course, there was one additional barrier to women's votes that persisted even after a federal amendment, and that was racism. It was true that the 15th Amendment 50 years before, in 1870, had expressly forbid states from denying the vote because of race. But by 1920, lawmakers in the South and West had set in place hurdles that, while silent about race, had the net effect of disenfranchising Black Americans. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses had effectively kept many Black men from casting their ballots since the 1890s. Along with that, unchecked intimidation and the threat of lynching sealed the deal. Local voting officials effectively constructed a color line, oftentimes without ever expressly invoking race. So did American women win the vote in 1920? Not all women. African American women in too many states became mere equals to their fathers and husbands. State laws disenfranchised them in an end run around the spirits of the 15th and 19th Amendments, and the registration numbers from 1920 reflect the effects of discriminatory laws. So what did Black women do? Well, first, it's important to note that even before the 19th Amendment, even before 1920, in some states, Black women were already at the polls. The first waves of Black women voters were unleashed as individual states made women's suffrage the law. In California, starting in 1911, Illinois in 1913, and New York in 1917. Black women were experienced voters already by 1920. Even more than managed to register and cast ballots in the fall of 1920 in the wake of the 19th Amendment. How did they do that? One example comes from St. Louis, Missouri, where Black women organized under the auspices of the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA, a branch named for the 18th century enslaved poet. There, Black women ran suffrage school, prepared for their chance to register, teaching one another how to pay poll taxes and pass literacy tests, even when administered by begrudging officials. And they turned out. Newspapers reported that nearly every woman in the city of St. Louis registered that season, Black and white. And still, Black women in St. Louis did not turn out merely to fulfill the promise of the 19th Amendment. They did not turn out merely in the spirit of encouraging women's participation in the body politic. Black women in St. Louis registered because that city was in the midst of implementing a housing segregation scheme that turned in part on the passage of referenda on election day. As recently as 1916, the city had initiated this strategy, and in order to see through the passage of segregation referenda, Black men in 1960 had been intimidated, threatened, some of them even arrested on false charges when they showed up at the polling places in 1916. Black women in 1920 in St. Louis register, yes, rooted in the promise of the 19th Amendment, but as much so in order to work on the problem of Jim Crow, of anti-Black racism and its rising tide in their city. Contrast St. Louis to the story of Daytona, Florida, where educator and club movement leader Mary McLeod Bethune traveled the state in 1920 to encourage Black women to register, much like in St. Louis. But in Florida, Mrs. Bethune was confronted by brutal opposition, terroristic violence each step along the way. Black women managed to join the voter rolls, but the intimidation continued on through Election Day. On Election Day Eve in Daytona, the Ku Klux Klan proudly announced and then made good on the promise to assemble in that city. White-robed Ku Klux Klansmen on horseback marched onto the grounds of Mrs. Bethune's girls' school in Daytona, aiming to intimidate her faculty, and intimidate the Black women of Daytona more generally. And It's important to say that the Klan doesn't wholly succeed in 1920. Mrs. Bethune and the Black women of Daytona do indeed turn out on election day. They show up to the polls in groups, in big numbers, in order to win some security in the safety of numbers. But by 1922, this violence persists in the state of Florida. The Klan again visits Mrs. Bethune's school, and she, along with many Black voting rights advocates in the state of Florida, abandon the prospect of casting their ballots, at least for a time, in the city of Daytona. So what are Black women to do in 1920 when they look out across the national landscape and they recognize that their experience of the 19th Amendment, their fulfillment of the promise of voting rights for women has been an uneven and deeply disappointing experience? What are they to do when they look out across the landscape and they recognize what a patchwork the nation is when it comes to Black women and voting rights? Well, some of the responsibility for answering that question, what to do next, fell to Hallie Quinn Brown, who was in 1920 president of the National Association of Colored Women, the largest Black women's political organization in the United States, an organization committed to women's suffrage and also committed, for example, to winning federal anti-lynching legislation in the same years. Hallie Quinn Brown understands that Black women will remain disenfranchised without federal intervention. And she develops a plan which calls for lobbying Congress to win legislation that would give teeth to the 19th and the 15th Amendments that would enable Black women to overcome the state law barriers that are keeping them from the polls. As she looks ahead to this plan, she's also looking for allies and lights on the notion that some of the leading women who had been associated with winning the 19th Amendment might now join with African American women to win federal voting rights legislation. Especially, Hallie Quinn Brown reaches out to Alice Paul, head of the National Women's Party, and in the winter of 1921 will call on Alice Paul, looking to secure her allyship in the ongoing struggle for Black women's voting rights. She calls upon Paul with a delegation from the National Association of Colored Women, and while their precise words have not survived, what we do know is that by the winter of 1921, Alice Paul will begin to fold up the National Women's Party, and by 1923 will announce her plan to work toward winning a new additional women's amendment to the Constitution. That would be the Equal Rights Amendment, which continues to awkwardly make its way toward ratification even today. In essence, Black women are left behind now to build their own voting rights movement, a movement that will take them from 1920 out of the ashes and the disappointments of the 19th Amendment all the way forward until 1965, finally winning that federal legislation in that year with passage of the Voting Rights Act. This movement has three prongs. One, we could say, was a continued commitment to the ongoing ground game of American politics in every election cycle. African American women continue when they can to register, to vote, to influence parties, particularly the Republican Party, whether it is the definition of platforms or the selection of candidates. And perhaps the best early example of this part of Black women's voting rights activism comes from Chicago, where African American women have been organized since 1913 and voting there since that year. By the 1920s, they are using their power at the polls strategically, concertedly, voting as a bloc. For example, in 1928, sending Oscar DePriest from Chicago to Congress in Washington, the first African-American man to sit in Congress since 1901. Black women organize around the necessary ground game of politics. And at the same time, this is a campaign that is also waged through law. Both litigation and lobbying are essential to this campaign that is mostly led by the NAACP. Here, NAACP advocates are chipping away at the edifice of voter suppression that has come to characterize the Jim Crow era, defeating poll taxes, defeating whites-only primaries, defeating grandfather clauses, and opening the way, modestly but importantly, for more Black voters to get to the polls on Election Day. And finally, the third prong, which really gained steam by the 1940s, is the modern grassroots civil rights movement, where now hundreds and thousands, and indeed tens of thousands of Black Americans, including Black women and girls, are a part of a grassroots social movement that insists on placing African-American voting rights, including Black women's voting rights, on the front burner of the nation's agenda, pressuring through the courageous, dangerous, and essential grassroots social movement work in the American South, forcing the hand of President Lyndon Johnson, forcing the hand of Congress, and winning in 1965 passage of the Voting Rights Act. And still, here we sit in 2020, and many American women do not enjoy the unqualified right to vote. As was true in 1920, it is true today, 100 years later, that voter suppression laws keep American women away from the polls. Voter ID laws shuttered polling places, the purge of voter rolls, exact match requirements, all in 2020 exacerbated by the exigencies of a pandemic, means that only some American women were able to cast ballots a week ago in the November 2020 contest. It turns out when it comes to the history of the 19th Amendment, we really don't have a tremendous need for myth. What we need is good, frank history that reminds us of how entrenched the suppression of voting rights is in our history that is a cautionary tale for our own time as we look out forward from the election season of 2020. And still, it would be a mistake, I think, to rest on the view that nothing has changed since 1920, because certainly a great deal has. And the evidence for how American politics have changed for African-American women, have been changed by African-American women, is all around us. We might take from the voting behavior of African-American women who have since 1920 voted as a bloc concertedly, using their power as women at the ballot box to change essential contests. We know that in the last two presidential cycles, African-American women are alone as Americans in voting, for example, more than 90% of them from Democrats nationally. So here, Black women as a force at the polls, something almost unimaginable for most Americans in 1920, is a fact in our own time. As you looked at your ballots, you may have noticed the African-American women who were running for public office in this year, nearly 130 Black women running for Congress in 2020. Again, a fact of American politics that is, or I should say was, unimaginable 100 years ago in 1920. And certainly, of course, the election of California Senator Kamala Harris to the vice presidency in 2020 was something that very few Americans beyond Black American women themselves could have imagined in 1920. And Senator Harris has been forthcoming about the political history out of which her successful run for the vice presidency has emerged. It is the history that I tell in Vanguard of 100 plus years of African American women's political activism. And perhaps you're like me and you were tuned in on that August evening when Senator Harris accepted the nomination, and she offered up a lesson in African American women's history as part of her remarks, explaining the women on whose shoulders she stands, not Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not Susan Anthony, not Alice Paul or Carrie Chapman Catt. Senator Harris pointed to 6 Black American women whose political activisms, traditions, inspiration, and more undergird her work today. They were, on that August evening, Mary Church Terrell, Ida B. Wells, Mary McLeod Bethune, Diane Nash, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Constance Baker Motley. And if those are names that are not familiar to you, this is your opportunity to expand your political education, to understand our new vice president and the political traditions out of which she comes. Those 6 women and more are now undeniably essential facets, an essential pantheon in the history of American politics. And I hope you'll come to know them better. I'll close by just offering what I think are 3 lessons that come out of the work the women of Vanguard have done over 200 years. And I know for this audience, you all activists, members, folks committed to the work of the League of Women Voters, I know that these lessons are among those that you all not only practice, but that you pass on to all of us. But I'll remind you of what they are. The first is that lesson about the ground game, that there's no substitute in any given election cycle for being actively, determinedly engaged in the ground game of American politics. And the women of Vanguard do not sit down, do not stay home, do not stop out, even in the face of a great deal of intimidation, a great deal of disappointment, and a great deal of discouragement. They stay in that ground game of American politics, and I think that's essential. At the same time, the women I write about are women who never abandon and never shy away from holding up their highest ideals for American democracy. That is to say, while politics is the art of profound compromise, oftentimes the women I write about never shy away when they have the pen, when they have the podium, when they have the microphone, from expressing their highest ideals from American democracy. That includes an American democracy free from racism, free from sexism, free from the voter suppression that has kept Black women from the polls for so many generations. We have to keep our ideals high and intact, even in the rough and tumble of politics. And finally, the women of Vanguard were deeply committed to politics as a long game. They never measured their successes by the outcome of any given election cycle. How could they when they remained disenfranchised across so many generations? The women of Vanguard, yes, were deeply committed to the ground game in any given election cycle. And at the same time, they remain deeply committed to the education, to the inspiration, to the enthusiasm, and to laying the foundation for the next generations of women and girls. And this is a part of their work that I have thought a lot about through this very troubled election cycle that has not concluded in 2020. How to measure our work, how to know if we're doing the right thing, if we're doing enough. One way to put it is the way my colleague and friend, Dr. Noelle Trent at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis put it to me just a few weeks ago. She asked me, what sort of ancestor will you be? That is to say that part of the way in which we will be judged here in our own time is not by the outcome of this contest that is still unfolding and playing itself out, but will be by the work that we did. What will we tell our daughters? What will we tell our granddaughters, our great-granddaughters about where we were and what we did in 2020? I think that sort of measure for our own time is the sort of measure that the women of Vanguard would appreciate very well. So with that, I think I'll pause and say thank you again for having me with you this evening. And if I'm not mistaken, Mara Braverman is going to join me, and we have some time still for questions and discussions. So it's really an honor to be with you in this auspicious moment in our political history, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, thank
Mara,
you
are you
very
there?
much.
Hi.
This is very interesting. And I have to say, I want to put a plug in for your book. I'm just a couple of chapters from the end, and I just have found it immensely informative, interesting, but also what I didn't really expect was that it would be gripping. In places, it's just like reading a novel. It's that same sense of being just a real page turner at times. So bravo, really wonderful. And I would urge everyone to get a copy and take a look at it. And I just want to reiterate that you can order it from our local independent bookstore, the Ivy. Always a great thing to support. So the first question we have is, what started you on the research for this book? And if you had to pick one thing that really surprised you from the research, what would that be?
Thanks for that. I knew the 19th Amendment centennial was on the horizon. And there were signs that even as the centennial was gaining steam, that African-American women's role in the story of the 19th Amendment and beyond might be overlooked. So I was very deliberate. I had long been a history of African-American women's politics, a historian of African-American women's politics. I was someone, deeply enmeshed in the literature in my field. And so I knew that there was a great deal there that would permit us to really tell a full 200-year history. So I really wanted to be a part of these conversations, and I wanted the women of Vanguard to be a part of our conversation. And I hoped, and I think it's been borne out, that the 19th Amendment centennial would be a moment in which we would be curious and open to learning new facets of the history that were less familiar. And I think that has turned out to be very much the case. Sorry, there was a second part of the question, which was—
if you had to choose one thing that most surprised you from your research.
Surprised me. Gosh. Well, I'll say that, frankly, it's the story of violence. And the role that violence plays in African-American women's political lives. And something different happens when parts of the story kind of disaggregated, and then you have the opportunity to set the stories alongside one another. And there are, among Black suffragists and voting rights advocates, there are very few who have not been either the target of violence or had an encounter with violence or lived vividly with the threat of violence in their public lives. And I had not really understood that, but unfortunately, I do now.
So I want to jump ahead to sort of our time right now. And we've had some questions about voter suppression. And based on what you learned about voter suppression through the many years, what really would be your advice to help us work on efforts now to make sure that we don't have the problems with voter ID laws and the lack of polling places in minority areas and the variety of other ways in which, so based on your research, what would be helpful to us today to know?
Sure. Restore the Voting Rights Act, for starters, right? That the circumstances of voting rights shifts dramatically after 2013, when the US Supreme Court guts the teeth, sort of takes the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act in the case of Shelby County versus Holder. I hope we have an opportunity to do the lobbying and to support lawmakers in Washington in 2021 to restore the Voting Rights Act. And that work has been ongoing and will continue, and we can be a part of that. So that is a very sort of nuts and bolts version of the answer. I think we also need to know what we think the standard is in this country, or the standard should be in this country. And that's the part of the Vanguard story, which is about setting your goals high. There is still no constitutionally guaranteed right to vote in this country. Query whether you think voting rights in this country should be universal. Query whether you think the state should bear the burden of fulfilling its obligation to guarantee voting rights to all Americans. And if you do, even in a state like Maryland, which prides itself on not practicing voter suppression. I had a chance to talk to Maryland lawmakers this past winter, just before the COVID shutdown, about this. And there's no reason why Maryland couldn't pass an amendment to its constitution that guaranteed to every Marylander over 18 years of age the right to vote, period, and shifted the burden to the state to fulfill that. Hold the bar high, whether it's on the state level or the federal level, but hold the bar high if you are among those, like I am, who believe that voting rights should be universal and guaranteed to Americans. We should not bear the burden, right, of overcoming the kinds of hurdles that we have, so many of us, confronted in 2020. So there is the ground game of the lobbying and the legislation. And then there is, I think, the holding the bar high, especially on the state level. Maryland can do better than it does on voting rights, even as it prides itself on not looking like Georgia or Wisconsin.
So you eloquently told us about how Alice Paul put aside the concerns of and the goals of Black women, and we can take it as given that a lot of her compatriots in both of the largely white organizations felt similarly. So what are the modern consequences of this? The fact that there were two groups of women working on voting rights, but really kind of went in different paths because of racism. And
so,
what are the repercussions today?
Sure. On the one hand, it means that Black and white American women oftentimes come to politics out of a very different sense of what the history and the tradition and the imperatives and the role models are. That's why we have to tune in and listen to Senator, now Vice President-elect Harris, and then do our homework, right, around that pantheon of women that she holds out, because our political trajectories have been that distinct, and the stories that we pass on and that we repeat and we use to undergird our own knowledge. So I think it's partly about our political imaginations and our political traditions. And the other consequence, I think, is voting behavior. Once again, this presidential contest has pointed up the distinct difference between Black and white American women. Black women have been voting as a bloc, using their power as women since 1920. And they use it to affect the outcome, state level, local, as well as federal contests. White American women split, and they've split again this year. And so it is difficult, sort of as an advocate, analytically and otherwise, right, to speak of American women as a force in American politics. And that, I think, is a legacy of the 19th Amendment that never, the 19th Amendment moment, that never really rolled up its sleeves to think hard about who American women were, where they were, and what it would mean to make women as women a force in American politics. And we see the results graphically yet again in this most recent election day.
So another question has noted that voting rights, of course, are very important, critical, but even with the ability to vote and the will to vote, as we see, because there was such a huge turnout, that Black and brown people face oppression in other aspects of their lives. And so how can we ensure that there's truly equal justice, not just voting rights?
Yeah, well, thank you, because, and that's such an important question for the women of Vanguard, because of course, I've written a 200-year history, and for most of that history, African-American women can't vote. And so Black women's politics is a model, in fact, for thinking capaciously, thinking creatively, being nimble in American politics. And so the women I write about, yes, they understand voting rights and the stakes in voting rights. They understand lobbying, they understand organizing, they understand patronage, and a great deal more. And this is how they build political influence despite being disenfranchised. I mentioned during my remarks, Mary McLeod Bethune, who is in Daytona, Florida, and is driven away from the polls by wanton violence in the 1920s. Well, by the 1930s, Bethune is in Washington. She builds the National Council of Negro Women, which is an umbrella organization for Black women's politics and associational life in Washington. She wins the attention of Franklin Roosevelt, so much so that Roosevelt calls on Mary McLeod Bethune to help him build what came to be known as his Black cabinet. What was the Black cabinet? It was Roosevelt, along with Bethune, using the power of federal appointments to bring Black Americans to Washington, despite the fact that they were disenfranchised. Mary McLeod Bethune, since the 30s and 40s, very powerful in Washington. She can't even vote in the state of Florida. She certainly can't run for public office, but through patronage, she not only herself wins an important federal post, she brings Black women with her from across the country, even women who themselves still cannot vote. So it's an essential part of the story. I think fast forward to our own time, and I think this has been an election season, a long drawn out one, in which we've seen the way in which the politics of the streets are a companion to the politics of the polling place. And in Baltimore, where I live, we saw that vividly illustrated in June in our primary election season, where the movement for Black Lives was convening nearly every night at City Hall. And on that June primary day, Baltimoreans, Black and white, those who hadn't voted by mail turned out to the polls and cast their ballots. So I think for me, part of the lesson is this holistic view. And the last thing I'll say, because it's important, is that the women of Vanguard are nimble, which is to say they are not fixated on the status or the particularity, right? Be it voting, office holding, or anything else. And perhaps the woman who most visibly exemplifies that in this season is leader Stacey Abrams from Georgia. And you all know that leader Abrams basically had an election for the governorship of Georgia stolen from her in 2018. Well, she didn't go home, and she didn't even just sit down and wait for the next election cycle. She pivoted. She founded Fair Fight, and we have seen, right, what she was able to do through her willingness not to be stuck on winning public office, right? Not being a one-note political leader, but being someone who had the capacity to pivot to organizing and to building a movement in Georgia and elsewhere, right? That I think when we do the mop-up, we will understand vividly made a tremendous difference in places like Georgia, and likely will continue to make a difference in Georgia. So that kind of leadership, right, which is to go where you're needed, right, where the moment calls you to go, is a different approach to politics than the kind of ladder climbing sort of power approach to politics. And I think for me, nobody better exemplifies that in this season than leader Abrams.
Yeah. Well, we have a note in the chat room that Stacey Abrams mobilized over 800,000 voters. So, I mean, incredible.
It is incredible, right? And she could have been, frankly, home or on the stump, building a nest egg for her next campaign, right?
Yeah.
And she didn't do that.
So we had a question come in about local Black suffragists, so local to here. And the person asking the question wanted to know if there were local Black suffragists who were arrested, who were jailed for things like picketing the White House or burning President Wilson in effigy. And if they were they treated more harshly than white women?
Yeah. So there are two answers, or at least two. One is there are local Black suffragists in Baltimore and Maryland, and I recommend you to the work of, among others, Jean Thompson, who has written importantly about them and has been among those who have organized to have a marker to them installed on Druid Hill Avenue as part of the state's overall marking of the women's suffrage centennial. Yes. And on the other hand, it's a mistake to look for Black women in places like Alice Paul's 1913 parade, her picketing of the White House. African-American women do not find a compatible place there. There are small numbers of Black women who participate in the 1913 parade, insisting on a place at the table in that very public display of women's political ambition and power. Only one African-American woman, as best we know, Mary Church Terrell, participates in the picketing, along with her daughter Phyllis, participates in the picketing of the White House. African-American women are not welcome in that phase of the suffrage movement. That phase of the suffrage movement is building itself and its power on a Southern strategy that requires that Black women be pressed to the margins in the hope that white Southerners, men and women, will come over to the suffrage cause. African-American suffragists do their work in organizations like the National Association of Colored Women, in their sororities, in their church organizations, in civil rights organizations, but they are not an important part of NAWSA. They are not an important part of the National Women's Party, and that is by design. The promise of the 19th Amendment, the promise that suffragists make, is that Black women will not get the vote. That is the premise of the 19th Amendment by the time we get to those years. And Black women, with some very courageous exceptions, make their politics elsewhere.
So I want to switch to a personal question I have. When I was reading the chapters in your book about that were set in the 1800s, I was astounded by the incredible number and array of sources that you found. Speeches, newspaper articles, convention programs, on and on. And I just, at a certain point, I started wondering, how did you find all this stuff? Because, and I was also amazed by, I was reading one part, an article, you quote extensively from an article that appeared in a publication in Vermont, which seems like a very off the track place to be looking for things for your topic. So can you give us a little insight into how you actually did the research?
Sure. Where to begin? I mean, I don't mean to be cheeky when I say, that's what historians do. We work with librarians, we work with archivists, we work with special collections, and we probe to find the materials that will help answer the questions that we have. The 19th century materials were materials I was more familiar with because that is where much of my earlier work had been centered. So I was able to go back to places that were familiar to me and ask new questions of the materials. And the 20th century, by the time we get to the 20th century, many of the women who figure in this book understand they're going to be the subjects of historians' curiosity. And so their papers are on deposit at places like the Library of Congress. And so those materials all exist. I was very much aided by what has now been more than 20 years of the digitization of early American newspapers. So I was able to approach the work in a way that I never had before because the digital technology has really changed. And you have to be willing to go looking for Black women's politics in places other than suffrage associations. Because if you go back to the papers of Naacp, you go back to the papers of the National Women's Party, you're going to be not only disappointed, you might misunderstand Black women as having been uninterested in suffrage politics. But when you follow Black women where they did gather and where they did do their political work, they are as committed as any community of American women from very, very early on in our history to the question of their rights and ultimately their political rights. And I'm going to say just one more thing, and please, I know people don't like to read footnotes. You don't have to read them, but peruse them, because what you'll see is that the other pillar of this book is the work of 3 generations of Black women's historians whose work I synthesize in this book in order to tell a complete story. So it's to say I stand on the shoulders of many, many formidable historians, including the late Dr. Rosalind Terborg Penn from Morgan State University, who really was a path breaker in this field and to whom I am profoundly indebted.
We have a message about this dialogue about suffragists cannot go on without referencing and honoring Juanita Grant, the first female organizer for the NAACP, organized everything east of the, let's see, what does it say? East of the Mississippi, another unsung hero. Could you briefly tell us a little bit about, because that's a name that's unfamiliar to me, and I bet is unfamiliar to a lot of people.
I welcome, maybe we should invite the questioner to join us and she can tell us more about it.
Okay, Deborah Nixon, can we unmute Deborah so she can talk? Deborah, are you on the call?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Thank you for that. Juanita Grant, to many of you, is the wife of Mr. Woody Grant, who worked with the State Department of Education in Baltimore and dealt with civil rights initiatives and equal access to education. Ms. Juanita Grant was a Maryland organizer for the NAACP and organized everything in Maryland effectively up to and inclusive of protest, voting initiatives, helped to organize the Freedom Summers, helped in addressing issues of protection for a lot of the civil rights activists that came into the South, up to inclusive of Miss Fannie Lou Hamer, and worked with her in getting a lot of speeches and that kind of thing done. She is literally, as I said, she's the first she was the first organizer for the National Association of Colored People, and still lives up just south of Elkton, up there where the NASA base is. Is that Aberdeen? She's right up there between Elkton and Aberdeen, where and that's where they still live. She worked closely with the Black female lawyer from Baltimore, who was the first Black woman to get her law degree. And right now her name is slipping me, so y'all gotta help. Because her first name is Juanita. And I can't think of the last name, and it's a prominent last name. Yes, yes, absolutely. But she helped in organizing a lot of the education cases that came out of Charles County. Senator Joanne Benson was active in a lot of those kinds of initiatives that got equal pay for educators. And Black women had key roles in that kind of an initiative. Right now, I'm serving as president of the National Coalition of 100 Black Women for Prince George's County, and one of our initiatives this minute to help us deal with the war that is coming, and it is a war for the moral high ground for America around voting rights and the prohibition of racial discrimination. Because there are two cases coming out of Arizona that the Democratic Party where the Democratic Party has challenged the state, and those cases have now woven their way up to the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, they were put on the docket for early January. And you very eloquently referenced the undermining of the Voting Rights Act. Well, I know that the Supreme Court has removed two of those legs of protection. Those two cases out of Arizona threaten the Voting Rights Act further by potentially where we have a prohibition of racial discrimination, of possibly taking away that language that prohibits racial discrimination. And the impact would ultimately be, we would be in an apartheid state again. And that is not acceptable. So I would invite any and everybody on this call to write your Supreme Court justices, demanding what that high ground ought to look like around the right to universal suffrage, as well as the prohibition of racial discrimination and sexual discrimination in the voting process. So, Madam Speaker, if that's about taking the high ground, I welcome the high ground.
Well, we thank you so much for that. Very much, Ms. Nixon. I really appreciate it, and I think you kind of embody what I was trying to suggest earlier, right? Which is that this centennial year has created some extraordinary spaces for us, yes, to do our work, but also to learn our history. So I thank you so much for introducing to us to Juanita Grant. And I have made my notes and will do my homework. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like to add my thanks to that as well. It just shows that we have many, many more women to still uncover and recognize and learn about. And so thank you so much for being with us tonight and answering so many of our questions. Thank you. And I'll turn it back over to Gail.
Yes, I want to also extend my thanks. I think what just kept going through my mind is how complicated repeating cycle these issues are, given, you know, where we are today, means that we have to just keep working. So we're going to wrap up. If you would like to purchase her book, we encourage you to do so through the Ivy Bookstore. Can we just take down the slide, please? Thank you. This is the last of 4 events that we have hosted since August. And I think many of you, when I was looking over the registration list, have participated in some or all of them. So we generally thank you for your support. We're going to take a break over the holidays, but we'll be back in 2021. If you have ideas of things you would like to hear about or creative ideas for bringing people together virtually, please share them with us at events@lwvbaltimorecounty.org. So enjoy the holidays. And again, I want to extend our thanks and gratitude to Martha Jones. That was a wonderful presentation. So thank you and good night.
Thank you, everybody. Okay.